Welcome into Words with Wallace. I'm your host, Nick Wallace, coming at you. It is Friday, June 23rd. We are about 24 hours out from the conclusion of the 2023 NBA draft. And as usual, guys, a lot has gone down since the last time we spoke. I think, the Wizards officially hit the big red button and blew this thing up. Chris Paul has been traded twice since my last podcast episode. And of course, we had 58 draft picks, and we're going to talk about each and every one. No, we're not going to talk about each and every one because I am still in the process of learning about a lot of the guys that were drafted last night. There's a few I obviously have a knowledge of, and we'll talk a little bit more about the winners and the big loser of the NBA draft, in my opinion. But before we get into that, man, we have three really, really notable trades to talk about. Of course, as you guys would expect, I have to talk about the trade with my beloved Boston Celtics, and of course, the deal that sent Marcus Smart to the Memphis Grizzlies, as well as a couple other deals that we need to go through before we can get into the results of the NBA draft. So let's not waste any time, man. We're going to dive into the first trade of the last week or so, the first notable trade anyways, and this was between the Phoenix Suns and the Washington Wizards. So let's start off with the Suns, right? This is, of course, a team that was very much contending for an NBA title. Of course, they were actually the most competitive team, you could argue, besides Denver this playoffs, as they were the only team to beat Denver twice in the second round of the Western Conference playoffs. And they actually made a really big splash move here. They received Bradley Beal as the headliner, of course, in this trade. They also received Isaiah Todd and Jordan Goodwin. Never heard of those people in my life. And then on the Wizards side of things, they received Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, cash considerations, 4 different first-round pick swaps over the next, I want to say, 8 or 9 years or so, and then 6 second-round picks. So, again, the meat and potatoes of this deal is Chris Paul was traded to the Washington Wizards, as well as Landry Shamet, 4 first-round pick swaps, 6 second-round picks, and the Suns got back basically just Bradley Beal in return. So let's talk about it, man. I think, of course, Washington made a bunch of moves here, as I already kind of mentioned. So we're going to talk about Washington and the outlook for, maybe if there are any Wizards fans listening to this, we'll kind of talk about more about the outlook and the direction of that team once we talk about all 3 of the moves at the conclusion of the third move here. But let's talk about the analysis from the Phoenix side at first, right? They get a guy in Bradley Beal, right? And this is, of course, a team that now, at least they have a big 3, if you will. We haven't, I feel like the era of big 3s in the NBA is kind of over. I know that was very popular, back in 2008 with the Celtics, of course, and the Heat as well. And then, we've had a few other big 3s along the way. But, Phoenix definitely has one in terms of 3 all-star level talents. And, of course, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and now Bradley Beal as well. But Bradley Beal, he's been kind of wasting away in Washington, as you will. I think he has a reputation as a really great scorer, a really great three-point shooter, but let's just kind of dive into how true that really is. Because, unfortunately for Bradley Beal, it's not 2018 anymore, right? Just some quick stats on Bradley Beal. I don't want to be too negative, but the guy hasn't played more than 60 games in a season since 2018. So, obviously, he's a smaller guard. He's been dealing with injuries on and off for the past couple years. And he did have some really bright moments during his career, namely in the 2019 and 2020 season, where he averaged 30-plus points a game. He did so the following season as well in the 2020-21 season. But then the past 2 seasons, he's kind of come back down to earth, averaging just 23 points per game. Again, has the reputation of being a really great sharpshooter, great three-point shooter. However, I think his reputation kind of exceeds the reality in this situation because he has shot just 33% from three-point land the past 2 seasons and is not overall as efficient as one might think. But, that being said, I do expect his three-point percentage to jump quite a bit when he's in Phoenix rather than rather than the time he spent with the Wizards, mainly because, look, he's of course, he was the focal point of the Washington offense. I know he had some talent surrounding him last year, with, of course, Kristaps Porzingis, who we'll talk about in a little bit, as well as Kyle Kuzma being surrounded by him. But that is absolutely nothing compared to being surrounded with Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. As we saw, there were dudes being left wide open in the playoffs for Phoenix. Guys like Landry Shamet had big moments. Torrey Craig was pretty good for them. Josh Okogie was left wide open all playoffs. And so you would kind of expect Bradley Beal to be taking a lot more open three-point shots in Phoenix rather than in Washington. So I would expect that three-point percentage to jump quite a bit, but he's not Klay Thompson, all right? He's not a straight-up sharpshooter. He is more of an all-around scorer, or at least he has been in Washington at this point. but there are some red flags with acquiring him still, right? First and foremost, again, he's kind of a defensive liability, right? He's only 6'4". He's never, been much of a perimeter defender, and certainly he's stepping into a Phoenix team that's kind of devoid of somebody to fill that role. Like, obviously it seemed like Josh Okogie got the most of their minutes in like the fifth man spot of their starting lineup because of his ability to defend on the perimeter. Bradley Beal certainly isn't helping them at that point. And again, I'd imagine Bradley Beal also takes that, fifth starting spot in at least to close out big games for Phoenix. And he's a massive downgrade on the defensive end of the court, rather than a guy like Josh Okogie or Torrey Craig, who Phoenix had last season. But that being said, they made a splash play, right? They obviously didn't give up much to get Bradley Beal in this situation, right? Like, again, just giving up Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, a bunch of pick swaps and some second round picks. I am confident in saying that Phoenix acquired the best possible player they could without giving up Booker, Durant, or Ayton in this situation, right? Obviously with the salary cap, kind of changing here, the new collective bargaining agreement, which we've talked a little bit about in past podcasts, that is coming into effect, or at least starting to come into effect this upcoming season. So it's going to be a lot more difficult for teams to afford, as many star players as they did in the past. But by making this trade work, and they're going to have to work around the margins and only be able to afford very small contracts surrounding their big 3 or 4 players. So the question just becomes: is it worth it is Bradley Beal worth it? Right? He's certainly the best player that they could have brought in, but would that money have been better spent on maybe getting another mid-level contract in the fold, or at least kind of using that salary cap and kind of dispersing it better to acquire more depth? Because Phoenix has literally no bench at this point. They, again, new owner here, another splash play. They got another guy to put on the poster. So we'll see what they end up doing. Now, they still have the ability to likely move DeAndre Ayton if they wanted to, and maybe, make the rare trade where, they give up the best player in the deal and give up DeAndre Ayton, but they acquire a few pieces to add to the bench, and maybe they cheap out at the center position. We will see. I would expect more moves for Phoenix to come because they have to find a way to fill out this roster somehow. But they certainly acquired the most talented player they could without giving up one of their existing big 3 players, right? They move on from Chris Paul, but we kind of saw that coming, right? Certainly it was reported, a couple weeks ago now by, I think, Chris Haynes of Bleacher Report, originally that Chris Paul was getting released, which of course ended up not being true, but we knew that it was likely, Chris Paul had already played his last game in Phoenix, and that came to fruition with this deal. Quickly, we'll talk about it from the Washington perspective. This was, you could look at it and be like, man, Washington got raked over the coals, right? They barely got anything for Bradley Beal, who's been their best player over the last 5 or so years. And while that's true, you have to remember that really, Washington screwed themselves when they signed Bradley Beal to this contract last year, right? It's a massive max contract for Bradley Beal. And he also has a no trade clause, which is extremely rare in this day and age. So basically, Bradley Beal had the ability to pick his destination, right? If he didn't want to play in Phoenix, he could have just said no to this trade. And of course, he picked Phoenix because he has a chance to contend for a title, and it's certainly a destination that a lot of pro players want to end up playing at. So Washington's hands were kind of tied with what they could do for Beal. Even though he's a talented player, you can't really look at him as an asset when he's being paid that much money. And, basically, they were able to really only recoup some scraps, but they have a lot more cap flexibility. Chris Paul is, of course, an expiring contract, and he was later moved again, which we will talk about shortly. So they acquired a lot more flexibility and at least some draft capital. And the big thing is they were kind of paying to get rid of Bradley Beal and get off of that massive contract for more flexibility in the future. So more on the Wizards to come. But again, overall, Phoenix rolled the dice. They're going to have a very talented team. We'll see how they decide to fill out the rest of their roster. I certainly don't love it as of right now because, again, I just think because of the defensive shortcomings and, Bradley Beal not being quite as good of a three-point shooter as we might imagine him to be, I don't think he's necessarily the best fit there, but it's hard to complain, when you look on paper and see what Phoenix gave up. They didn't give up a ton to get a guy as talented as Bradley Beal. So we will see how Phoenix decides to, fill out the rest of their roster here. Now let's talk about, most likely the one that you guys are most interested in hearing about. There was a very big deal that took place about 2 nights ago now, on the night of June 21st, right before the NBA draft, that, sent away Marcus Smart from the Boston Celtics in a deal with the Grizzlies and a deal that the Wizards were involved with as well. So let's get into it, guys. Let's kind of go through the details of the trade first. Let's start with the Celtics. In this deal, the Celtics received Kristaps Porzingis, the center from the Washington Wizards. They were able to acquire the number 25 pick in last night's draft, which of course they later traded out of that spot. They traded back in the draft a few times. And they also acquired a 2024 first round pick of the Golden State Warriors. So what's likely going to be a very late pick in next year's draft as well, but still a first round pick for the Celtics next year. The Grizzlies in this deal, they received only Marcus Smart. And the Wizards received Tyus Jones of the Grizzlies, who was a backup point guard there last season. Danilo Gallinari and Mike Muscala, who were, Gallo got hurt, didn't play last year for the Celtics, and Mike Muscala, who was kind of like our 11th man last year, as well as the number 35 pick in last night's draft. So again, the Celtics, they basically were able to move up 10 spots in the draft last night. They got Kristaps Porzingis, and they got a future first. Grizzlies get Marcus Smart, and the Wizards really just get Tyus Jones, a early second-round pick, and then some contract filler, right? Let's break it down, right? The headline here for, fellow Boston sports fans is the Celtics move on from Marcus Smart, right? This was a deal that came to the surprise of many, and apparently to the surprise of Marcus Smart as well. So let's kind of talk about it, right? I think it really comes down to a heart versus brain debate, right? And let's start off by saying, it's okay. It's okay to be sad that we gave up Marcus Smart. It sucks. I'm certainly not the biggest Marcus Smart guy, but I think you're a little heartless if you don't get a little emotional at the thought of Marcus Smart wearing a different team's jersey. Again, he's been on the team for 9 seasons now. We got him in the 2014 draft, I want to say. Yeah, right. That makes sense. And he's everything you could have wanted in a Boston Celtic over the past 9 years, right? He embraced the city in a way unlike really any other athlete during my life, right? Especially for a non-superstar player, right? You've had, famous Red Sox like David Ortiz embrace the city, and of course Brady embraced the city in certain ways, Gronk, guys like that. But as on the Celtic side of things, I think he was the happiest to be a Celtic out of really anyone I've ever seen in my life of supporting this city. So it's really awesome to see. He obviously had some accolades during his time with the Celtics as well, being on an all-defensive team 3 different times. He was a 3-time winner of the Hustle Award. For what that's worth, I don't really know, but and of course a 1-time Defensive Player of the Year when he was able to win that. Basically 2 years ago now, he was the Defensive Player of the Year. And this all came on really fast, right? As Celtics fans know, I had a few of you guys reach out and text me about the original trade that was reported, and it was basically similar guidelines, right? It was a 3-team trade between the Celtics, the Wizards, and then the third team in the original scenario was actually the Clippers, right? And instead of Marcus Smart being the centerpiece of the deal for the Celtics, it was actually Malcolm Brogdon. So basically it was, Brogdon and scraps for Porzingis, right? That was the original offer, and it was reported. It was, likely going down, and Woj and a bunch of other people had tweeted about it. And then it was reported, a couple hours later, basically 5 hours later, that the deal had fallen apart, right? The sides couldn't come to an agreement. Eventually, we learned that the Clippers were basically scared of, the medical history of Malcolm Brogdon. They couldn't get a physical in time or something like that, and they lost interest, and all sides decided to move on. I shouldn't say all sides, but I guess Clippers decided to move on, and then Memphis and Boston, of course, continued to pursue the deal. And then very shortly after it was announced that the original deal had fallen apart, they agreed upon this offer here that sent Marcus Smart. They subbed him out for Brogdon, and they found the other third team, which of course was the Grizzlies in this scenario, and the trade happened. So yeah, man, it's okay to be sad to miss Marcus Smart. This really sucks. It came on really fast, and obviously, us Celtics fans love Brogdon, but he's certainly not as, attached to the fan base as a guy like Marcus Smart was. So if you're going to get mad at anyone, my friend Connor, of course, pointed this out, you can get mad at the Clippers, right? We could have, had Porzingis without having to give up Marcus Smart. If there's anyone you should be frustrated with, I don't think it should be the front office of the Celtics for trying to improve the team here. I think you should be pissed at the Clippers for backing out of this deal at the 12th hour, right? But yeah, man, again, we traded our longest tenured player, the heart and soul of a team. And we got back a guy who has a lot of upside in Kristaps Porzingis, but he's also a guy that has, only played in 60 or more games 3 out of his 8 years in the league, right? Again, Kristaps was drafted 1 year after Marcus Smart. He's played 8 seasons, and he's only reached 60 games in 3 out of the 8 seasons that he's played. So major health red flags with Porzingis all over the place. But he has a lot of upside, which we'll talk about. And I have to talk about this now, right? I think it stings the most. I saw the shitty Photoshop of Marcus Smart wearing a Grizzlies jersey. That one really stings, right? Of course, we didn't end up trading him to one of our in-conference rivals like Philly or Miami or Milwaukee. So there's certainly worse destinations that we could have sent Marcus. It's nice that he's on the West Coast, a team that likely we wouldn't face unless we somehow met them in the finals, which would be nuts. We wouldn't have to face them in the playoffs, of course. But I hate Memphis. I absolutely hate Memphis. You guys know I hate Memphis. It's been well documented on this podcast. So, I'm going to root for Marcus Smart. I'm going to root for him for the rest of that guy's career, for what he's done for Boston, how great of a Celtic that he was. But it really sucks. I have anybody on Memphis that I think is likable, because Marcus Smart, I'm going to have to root for him, even though he's wearing a Memphis jersey, right? So, yeah, it's okay. It's okay to be upset about the deal if you like Marcus Smart, if you care about the team, if you care about the culture that we've had over the past couple of years. But, after thinking about it, 24 hours after the trade or so, I kind of landed on, the more I think about it, my brain is telling me that I think the deal makes sense, right? I think it obviously remains to be seen if this deal will pay off, but I think the risk is worth the potential reward, right? It's indisputable that this deal, where the Celtics acquire Kristaps Porzingis, and as well as, they traded up in the draft, and then, of course, a future first-round pick. It is indisputable that this deal raises the ceiling of the team. If everything goes well and Kristaps is healthy for us throughout this upcoming playoff run next season, then the deal, the ceiling of the team will be higher. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Kristaps is that talented of a player. And let's kind of talk a little bit more about Kristaps Porzingis for you guys that don't know a lot about him. He provides something that the Celtics have not had in a very long time. And that's just, first and foremost, a massive dude, right? That guy's 7'3". That's huge. That is absolutely massive, right? He's what? Out of the guys that actually play in the NBA, is he the second tallest player behind Wemby? No disrespect to Boban. I don't think he's getting many minutes. Maybe he's the third tallest player in the NBA. But Kristaps is absolutely huge. And that's, again, big guys don't often last very long injury-wise. So that's probably why he's had so many, injuries pop up and injuries plague him throughout his career. But he's a really unique player. They called him the unicorn. That'd be a shitty nickname. They called him the unicorn, mainly based off of his time when he was drafted by the Knicks in 2015, because of how well he could move for a guy at 7'3". He provides really, really great rim protecting. Of course, that makes sense. He's 7'3". He's averaged basically 2 blocks a game for his entire career. Really solid floor spacing as well. He can shoot the 3 ball. He shoots 36% from 3-point range on his career. And part of the reason that we went out and made this deal is because this guy's actually coming off of, arguably his best season as a pro. You could certainly make that argument with Washington, of course. He had his career high in points. He averaged, 23 points a game. Career high in assists as well. He averaged 3 assists a game. And he shot a career best in total, as far as efficient field goal percent shooting goes as well. So, when healthy, again, keyword, when healthy, he provides some really unique stuff for the Celtics, right? Because it gives us a lot of flexibility with our front court, right? He can play alongside Al Horford, right? And when he is playing alongside Al Horford, he can essentially be the center, right? He can be in the dunker spot. He can stay close to the basket while a guy like Al is still able to space the floor. If we want to, play him alongside a guy like Rob Williams, Rob Williams obviously, lacks a perimeter jump shot at this point in his career. We can still have Porzingis spacing the floor while Rob Williams is in that dunker spot. He can play alongside both of our current big men flawlessly, right? And again, still, if we want to go 5 out and have, Al, Porzingis, Tatum, Brown, and White out there and have, 5 3-point shooters that could make it a lot easier to get to the basket, a lot easier for us to get hot and break down a zone like what you might see against Miami. So, again, I think that when healthy, he adds a huge ceiling to the team. What the frustrating thing about it, and again, my biggest issue is look, we're giving up a sure thing in Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart's obviously battled a lot of different injuries throughout his career. For those that follow this team closely, that, he was certainly not at the level he was when he won. He was not at the level he was last season as he was the previous season when he won Defensive Player of the Year. He definitely took a step back. It looked like he was kind of battling through injuries all year, but even when Marcus Smart's hurt, you kind of expect him to play through it at this point. You certainly don't have that same expectation here with Kristaps. And Marcus Smart is as close as you can get to a sure thing. Even when the offense is shaky and that some of the decision making is shaky, he's going to give it 100% on defense. He's going to make a couple wow plays that can swing momentum in a game. And you're getting a guy that you just don't know is going to be out there in Kristaps. And I think it's really frustrating because, look, RJ and I identified after, when we talked after the Celtics got bounced, look, obviously the number one thing that this team needs is another big in some way, shape, or form. And preferably just a younger guy, maybe someone that just can eat up minutes that we can survive with during the regular season because, again, Al Horford was unbelievable. That dude's what? Is Al 36 now? He's not going to be able to continue to play 100+ games of basketball multiple seasons in a row and be really good for us in the playoffs. at some point, like, Al's entering, he's in the twilight of his career, right? We cannot continue to expect this level of production for him. We got blessed again with overall, I know he had his ups and downs in the postseason, but a really solid postseason from Al still. If we want to have anything close to what we got from his postseason production last year, if we want to get that again this upcoming season, we have to drastically reduce his minutes during the regular season. And you would like to think that Rob Williams could be the guy to put out there because he's younger, but as Celtics fans know, Rob Williams is also made of glass. So there's still not like a go-to big man in the rotation to just eat up minutes in the regular season, do the dirty work. And so I would expect us to add another big at some point, and it sucks that we're trading away Marcus Smart and we're making this big splash play, and we still have somewhat of a need of a fourth big in our rotation. Now, maybe that ends up being Grant Williams. You could argue he has some positional flexibility. I know he's an undersized power forward or whatever you want to call him, but if we're able to maintain Grant, could he eat up some of those minutes? Certainly, but Lord knows it's not going to be a guy like Luke Cornett. I'm so tired of seeing that guy. He shouldn't even be on the team, even as like a 13th man. So, we'll see what the Celtics end up doing, but I think it does kind of answer a few questions about what the rest of this Celtics offseason will look like, right? The front office recognized that something had to give, right? As RJ and I talked about, yes, they've had a lot of success over the past, 7 or so years with this current team, right? A bunch of Eastern Conference Finals appearances, of course, the Finals appearance, in the previous season against the Warriors. They've had a lot of success, but ultimately it's kind of run its course with the current core, right? Like it didn't seem like this team was suddenly going to get over the hump next season, especially with teams like Denver emerging and whatnot. So something had to give. And I am glad that if they were going to make a splash play to one of our core 4 or 5 guys, that they decided to move on from Marcus Smart and not a guy like Jaylen Brown. Because the Jaylen Brown thing, as we've talked about before, could go wrong in a lot of different ways. If we don't offer him the max contract, he's going to get super pissed, and then we're going to end up having to trade him for likely 75 cents or 50 cents on the dollar. And really, anybody you trade Jaylen Brown for is not going to be as good as Jaylen Brown, or at least is not going to be as good as Jaylen Brown is right now to help us win. Because if we do trade Jaylen Brown for a guy like Scoot Henderson, who ended up going with the 3rd pick to Portland or something like that, I know that was a common offer that was thrown around. Yeah, Scoot could end up being really good someday, but the odds that a rookie is able to step in on a championship team and, compete alongside Jason Tatum, who's entering the prime of his career, suddenly we're then wasting Tatum, some of his prime years and all that shit. Like, again, it's best to not mess around with a guy like Jaylen Brown. Just pay him the max contract that he's, for the most part, earned over the last several years. So if they were going to make a splash play, I'm very happy that it's for, moving on from a guy like Marcus Smart rather than a guy like Jaylen Brown. It is worth noting I'll talk about it from the Grizzlies' perspective in a second. Let me just stay on the Celtics for a little bit longer here. We still, especially now that, Gallinari, he might have been able to give us something. We signed him to a contract before last season. He got hurt before the season started, didn't play any games for us. He was a guy that I was looking forward to having back, to have an extra scoring wing and a veteran presence off the bench. We literally have no wings off the bench behind Tatum and Brown. So that is a need we very much need to address. Maybe we decide to just sign another big and, Grant is that wing in that situation. I don't really know, but I think it would be nice to get some youth there. I was hoping that they were going to end up taking a wing with the 25th pick that they acquired in this deal. That, of course, didn't end up happening, but we definitely need to add some wing depth, potentially add another big man to the rotation. And this is kind of a cool opportunity for Peyton Pritchard as well, I should touch upon, right? He's a guy that actually, I don't know if I mentioned it on the podcast before, but he did request a trade a couple weeks back, which I understood and respected. I think that dude is way overqualified to be a 4th guard in a rotation. I'm sure he was just asking for a trade, not because he hated Boston or anything like that, but mostly because he wants to get to that first big, free agent contract, right? He wants to prove his worth, make his money, and play on a team and get more minutes during the regular season. It didn't look likely that it made sense that he wasn't playing last year. He was far and away our 4th, he was only our 4th best guard. He's behind White, he's behind Smart, he's behind Brogdon. Now he's back, he should be the first guard off the bench for us if things stay as is, right? Assuming he still wants to be in Boston in that trade request. We don't meet now that he's happier with a bigger role in Boston. I think he's perfectly capable to be our backup point guard, and I am excited to see him in an expanded role this upcoming season for the Celtics. Obviously, defensively, he has, some red flags because of his size and whatnot, but he fights hard. He can be a spark off the bench. He can take tough shots, make tough shots, solid 3-point shooter. Excited to see Peyton Pritchard in a longer role. And another good thing about the deal is, look, Kristaps Porzingis, I should mention, part of the reason this deal was able to get done is because he had a player option for this season. There was some indecision and some ambiguity around if he was going to opt into that player option for, I think it was like $36 million for this upcoming season because of the success he had last year, right? He's coming off of a really good season in Washington. People might think that he would decline that option and become like a either restricted free agent or unrestricted free agent and seek a longer term contract. He's like, nope, I'm going to take my $36 million, and maybe he's kind of betting on himself to perform again to get an even bigger contract after this upcoming season. If he continues on the trajectory that he's on and strings together 2 solid seasons in a row here, a team will be willing to pay him a lot of money. So we don't. But the good thing for the Celtics in the short term is we are not committed to Kristaps Porzingis long term. If he gets hurt in the middle of the season, which, knock on wood, I'm hoping does not happen, of course. Even if things, kind of break for the worst, we are not committed to Kristaps Porzingis on the long term. So I think that is another positive. And the last piece I will say for the Celtics is hopefully Malcolm Brogdon isn't too pissed, right? I mean, he was effectively traded for 5 hours the other day. So again, he's a professional. I'd imagine he's been traded before. Of course, we acquired him last offseason from Indiana in a trade. So we do know, and I think he was probably traded from Milwaukee before that as well. So he's been around the block a few times. He's a professional. He's not as tied to the city as Marcus Smart was, of course. So hopefully he's not too pissed. And hopefully we can retain him for next season because we're going to need him a lot more in the absence of Marcus Smart, of course. So a lot of Celtics talk there. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Definitely let me know what you think of the Marcus Smart deal. And, we'll see how the Celtics decide to fill out the rest of this roster as well. But let's move on to talking about it from the Grizzlies' perspective, right? The low-hanging fruit, is that Marcus Smart, they acquire him, right? And he is exactly who Dillon Brooks thought he was, right? We talked about it earlier on this podcast, but Dillon Brooks, of course, was kind of positioned as the scapegoat for Memphis's shortcomings in the first round of the playoffs. And it was made very clear that he would not be back in Memphis as soon as the season ended. And they got a guy in Marcus Smart who is, he's basically built in a lab for the grit and grind culture that Memphis has been preaching over the past decade or so, right? He's obviously gritty. He's obviously going to give 110%, and he's stepping into a team that is, competing in the Western Conference, right? I wouldn't necessarily call them a title contender, but they've definitely had some really great regular season success over the past couple of years. I can't deny that. And they are in desperate need of a point guard, right? I should mention that some more notable news that I didn't even mention at the top since the last podcast is that the decision on Ja Morant as far as his suspension for the second Instagram Live gun incident was announced, and Ja is to receive a 25-game suspension, I believe, for the start of next season. So obviously that is, a little more than a quarter of the season, right? Basically a third of the season, Ja is going to be gone. So they need a point guard, right? Now, it is worth noting that I think the Grizzlies paid a pretty steep price to upgrade from their previous backup point guard in Tyus Jones to Marcus Smart. They basically traded Tyus and 2 late firsts for Marcus Smart. So pretty steep price to pay, considering I do like Tyus Jones. A lot of people around the league do, and he's kind of the gold standard of what you would want in a backup point guard. But obviously Marcus brings way more to the locker room as far as a culture setter, as far as a veteran presence, as far as a guy that's probably a little bit more respected around the league. He brings a lot more intensity on the defensive end. But it is a lot for Memphis to give up there, and they kind of still need another guard, right? It's not like Marcus is going to be playing 40 minutes a game for the first 25 games of the season. I would expect Memphis to either find an option in-house and maybe promote someone from the end of their bench to a bigger role, or at least acquire maybe some other veteran guard just to prepare for the very least for the first 25 games of the season without Ja. But that being said, I'm going to root for Marcus Smart, as I said before. I'm always going to love that guy. It sucks that he's in Memphis and I have to root for at least somebody on Memphis. But I do think, for this season, at least in the short term, he's going to be really good for Memphis. He still has some left in the tank, even if he's not, the same defensive player of the year from a couple years ago. I think he's going to, they're going to love him there. There's no questions about that. And so they answered the Ja suspension in the best way that they could, and they were willing to pay a couple late firsts to get in on that. So I think that basically covers it from Memphis's perspective. So let's talk about it from Washington's perspective again, real quick. This is a better result from they didn't get a ton. They didn't get a massive haul for Kristaps Porzingis. Just as a reminder, they did receive Tyus Jones, Danilo Gallinari, Mike Muscala, and the number 35 pick in last night's draft. So they didn't get a huge haul for Porzingis, but you have to remember, right? Porzingis could have opted out of that deal, and again, he either would have become he would have been a free agent in some capacity, so there was a chance that the Wizards were just going to lose Kristaps for nothing. So even though he's coming off a career year, and you look at this trade that just transpired, I don't think that there was this massive market for Kristaps Porzingis, right? I think they kind of made the most of the situation that they're in, and it is certainly no secret that they're tanking at this point. They did end up trading the number 35 pick in last night's draft. They didn't keep and make that selection, so that's worth noting as well. And they did get a guy in Tyus Jones where, look, you got to pay somebody, right? They're going to have a guy in Tyus Jones who, whether if they decide to keep him, he's going to be a good veteran presence for some of the guys they did bring in the draft last night. They drafted, oh boy, his name's like Bilal Kubliale. That's a tough name for me right now, but he's actually Victor Wembanyama's teammate, coming from that French team there, who is a great athlete, shown some real defensive flashes. So they have a young guy like that, and some other young guys on their roster. Of course, Johnny Davis from last year. They can learn a lot from Tyus Jones, so he's the type of guy you want in your locker room. And on top of that, maybe they're not done moving, right? Maybe they're not done making moves. They certainly have a couple more big decisions to come with Kyle Kuzma and whatnot. Maybe Tyus Jones is sent to another team because, again, he is a trade asset. He is a really big trade target for teams that are going to be point guard needy. And even if they don't decide to move him before the end of the offseason, he could be somebody that the Wizards look to move in this upcoming trade deadline in February of 2024. So that puts a bow on the Marcus Smart, Kristaps Porzingis, and Tyus Jones trade. Okay, so we have one more trade to run through before we get into exactly what transpired last night on the night of the NBA draft. And this one's probably the most fun. Certainly not a trade that I saw coming. I can't imagine many other people did either. But this one was a trade between the Warriors and the Wizards. So Wizards' third move. And this one, the Warriors received Chris Paul. So Chris Paul, who was on the Wizards for about 4 days there, something like that, is now on the Golden State Warriors. And in that deal, in return for Chris Paul, the Wizards received Jordan Poole, Ryan Rollins, don't know exactly who that is, a 2030 protected first-round pick, and a 2027 second-round pick. So in a nutshell, the Warriors actually paid up to get off of Jordan Poole's contract is essentially what that comes down to, right? They threw in a protected first-round pick way down the road, as well as a 2027 second-round pick in addition to Jordan Poole to get off of that massive contract that they signed him to last offseason. And in return, they have basically a one-year rental of Chris Paul, who's on an expiring contract after this season. So let's start analyzing this trade from the Warriors' perspective, right? This is genuinely like a very fascinating trade, because basically Chris Paul does not fit what Golden State likes to do whatsoever, right? Golden State's all about movement, it's all about cutting, it's all about 3-point spot up shooting, things of that nature. Where Chris Paul is a lot slower paced, he's a lot more methodical. He likes to have the ball in his hand and kind of orchestrate and diagnose things as they happen. The Warriors, it's all about like a style of play that, again, just doesn't really fit Chris Paul's style, especially 37, 38-year-old Chris Paul, whatever he is at this point. So it's certainly not like a great fit on paper. But that being said, I do trust that the Warriors have some of the best basketball minds there are, right? And they have some of the smartest players in the league, and Steph and Draymond, of course, and pairing him up with, Chris Paul, the point god, if you will, kind of a corny nickname, but whatever, one of the smartest dudes in the NBA in his own right. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I do think that they're going to be able to figure it out, right? I think, the safe assumption for Chris Paul's role is like, look, the positive thing, if you're Chris Paul, is obviously you're getting a chance to contend for a championship if you're part of Golden State, right? If you can't beat him, join him. He's going to be on the Golden State Warriors, and he's going to have a chance to contend for a title. You could argue he would have had a chance for a title in Phoenix, but, for whatever it's worth, he's still on a contending team, so that's great for him. He's also on a team that, shouldn't really have to put many minutes on Chris Paul during the regular season, right? He should very much be their backup point guard and their guy off the bench to generate offense, right? So it should be interesting to see how maybe he can kind of bring a life to, some of the role players that are in need of maybe a more traditional point guard, and a guy like Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody. Maybe he can get those guys going with some traditional point guard play. But I don't know. I don't know if that's going to work out, right? It did kind of seem like Chris Paul's jump shot was kind of, his 3-point shot anyway was failing him a bit toward the end of last season. But that being said, when you look at the stats, he actually still shot, what was it? I think he shot like 37% last season. So, or 38% on the year last year. So Still a solid enough three-point shooting. He has had to adjust many times in his career, like he had, his 1 year in Oklahoma City, where he kind of dragged that team into the playoff picture, right? Chris Paul also played alongside James Harden, which was, again, very conflicting styles of basketball there, in addition to all of his years of success in New Orleans and Los Angeles. So Chris Paul always finds a way to help his team win. So it is funny to see him in a Golden State jersey next season, and we'll see how it all plays out. I'm excited to see exactly how that dynamic looks through the first couple games of next season. Another notable thing from the Warriors' perspective is, look, it ended the awkwardness, if you will, the rift between Draymond Green and Jordan Poole. As I'm sure you guys have heard, this has been covered ad nauseum, but Jordan Poole, punched the shit out of Draymond Green punched the shit out of Jordan Poole at the start of last season. The video was somehow released and everybody saw it, and it was awkward, and Draymond, covered it on his podcast and all that stuff. And basically, it was pretty obvious that, look, no matter how much the team talks about how they've moved past it, it's always going to be awkward between Draymond Green and Jordan Poole. And there was also an added awkwardness because the front office of the Warriors decided to pay Jordan Poole after their championship title last year, and they didn't extend Draymond Green, and they still haven't for that matter. But it does seem like they're siding with Draymond, they're siding with his preferences, and they're moving on from Jordan Poole. They should have the money to pay Draymond. I would fully expect Draymond Green to be back in a Golden State uniform next season. And I think that the front office made the right decision in obviously deciding to keep Draymond over Jordan Poole if one of those two really did have to go. And finally, let's talk about it from Washington's perspective. This is, again, their third move, obviously. Let the tanking begin, right? First and foremost, they were on my purgatory list when I did the tier rankings a couple months ago at this point, right? And that's a really hard place to get out of, right? They're in purgatory for a reason. I was telling them that they needed to hit the button and blow the thing up, and they finally did. Now, given that Washington moved on from their three biggest named players in the past couple days, you would have kind of liked to see them accumulate at least more first-round picks and maybe some at least more desired or higher value first-round picks if they were going to give up that much talent. That being said, you have to understand that the guys that they traded, they weren't in the best contract situations, right? Beal was massively overpaid, right? It's pretty unlikely that he lives up to the contract that Washington signed him to last offseason. Of course, we just ran through Porzingis a couple minutes ago. And then Chris Paul, he was a one-year rental, right, who they acquired and then immediately, traded away back to Golden State, right? So, you kind of understand that the draft capital isn't going to be all that it's cracked up to be when you see the names on paper. But I do think it's worth noting, look, I'm not a Jordan Poole guy. We all know that. But love him or hate him, I think it makes complete sense for Washington to target a guy like that, right? First and foremost, you got a guy that is young. You got a guy with upside. You got a guy with a lot of talent. And shout out to the sales team in Washington, right? You need somebody to sell. I've been there. I've been in that inside sales room for a not super exciting franchise. You need somebody to put on the posters. You need somebody to drive ticket sales. And at least, Jordan Poole is a recognizable face. He's been on a championship team. He has a ring, right? He's made some insane, for every dumb, boneheaded play that he makes an equally insane shot on offense, a crazy highlight play that, viral social media loves, right? So I think that you need somebody like Jordan Poole, and you also literally need to pay somebody, right? There is a salary, cap floor that exists in the NBA, and Washington would probably be in danger of not even meeting that floor if they weren't paying Jordan Poole his insane contract, which I think was 4 years, $128 million. So yeah. With that, they can see, that contract to the end if they really want, or they can look to move him if he's able to, build up some of his trade value when he's out there taking 25 shots a game for the Wizards next season. So I enjoy it because I'm not a Jordan Poole guy, and now he is literally sent to basketball purgatory off of, a team that I really enjoy watching in Golden State. So this is a good one for me as well, personally. And of course, right, Washington's hitting the button. They're tanking. That's been established. You would, if you're picking nits, like to have seen them done this a little bit earlier, like I talked about. I know it's hard to just uproot everything mid-season. I'm not saying they should have done it when I said to do it during the original tier ranking podcast or anything like that, but it just would have been nice for them to have already started the tanking process so they could have had at least a shot in hell at Victor Wembanyama, who of course was taken number 1 by the Spurs last night, because that guy really is that special. And I'm not exactly sure what the prospects look like over the next couple years in the draft, but they're not going to get a guy like Victor at the top like they would, like they could have had a chance at if they were tanking before this season, because it's been obvious for several years that Washington was never going to contend for a title with Bradley Beal as its best player. So finally, we've made it through the trades. I know I spent a lot of time on those trades, but frankly, I think the trades are a little bit more fun to analyze. Again, I've been very candid with my lack of knowledge on a lot of these draft prospects, so I wanted to spend more time analyzing the moves and the big storylines that have gone down over the last week rather than just focusing on each individual, draft pick, right? So we're not going to be doing that, but let's kind of go through the draft and kind of talk about my general thoughts at first, right? The first thing that jumped out to me was it was really cool and unique to see, obviously, how much the game has grown. It feels like we can talk about that each and every year. But in this year in particular, right, 2 of the top 7 picks in the draft, only 2 of those guys came from college basketball, came from the NCAA, right? Of course, you had Victor Wembanyama from France coming from at the number 1 spot. You had, a college player in Brandon Miller at number 2, and then you had Scoot Henderson from the G League at the number 3 pick from the G League Ignite. You had 2 guys from Overtime Elite, the Thompson twins, who I literally did not know Overtime Elite existed until a couple weeks ago, so that's cool. It's a separate league altogether, for non-pro players or semi-pro players or whatever. Then you had another college player go at number 6 in Anthony Black, and then finally you had Victor's teammate to round out the top 7, who came over from the Metro 92 team in France. So pretty cool to see that, again, only 2 of the top 7 coming from college ball. It seems like a trend that's going to continue over the next decade or so. It's really a credit to the NBA for how much they've grown the game. It's super cool to see. So, secondly, my experience watching the draft, right, I think it became increasingly frustrating for me as we got into the late, the late first round and certainly the early second round. Because it was really, really confusing with how many trades were going down. I'm obviously not going to break down all the draft pick trades because it was insane. Again, this is really one of the only 2 times of the year where trades actually, take place. It's around the NBA draft, and then, of course, at the trade deadline are the only times these moves tend to get done. So that being said, it was extremely confusing when we hit the mid-20s. And, of course, part of my disdain was because, again, I was pretty hopeful that the Celtics were going to take like a young, exciting wing at the 25th pick. I had actually outlined to my guy Connor. He was asking me who I wanted the Celtics to take at 25, and I was like, I really like, I haven't done much research, but I really like this guy Jet Howard from Michigan, right? He's Juwan Howard's son. He's got, great size at 6'8". He could be the wing that we're looking for. He shoots it at a high clip. He's a little raw, but I love the talent. And then he goes number 11. So I was hoping he was going to be there. I think a lot of the mocks had him in the mid-20s, and then Orlando actually ends up reaching on him and taking him at number 11. So that was a pretty big disappointment for me there. And then it only got worse because the Celtics proceeded to trade back a couple times. Just my last Celtics nugget here. I think the only guy that they ended up with actually selecting was they ended up with the 38th pick, and they took Jordan Walsh, a forward out of Arkansas. Don't know a ton about him, but at this point, if the Celtics decided to move back multiple times, I can't imagine that they identified anybody in the late 20s or early second round that they saw as a guy that could immediately come in and play a part in a rotation on a team that's contending for a championship, right? That's the expectation for the Celtics. It's so hard to do what the Nuggets did in Christian Braun and find a guy that can immediately step in to a championship rotation and make a real difference. So the Celtics were probably like, yeah, we're not going to find anybody in this zone. So I would expect them to address those needs at, the wing position and the needs at big man with more veteran presence and subsequent free agent signings and trades to come. Because I don't think, no disrespect to Jordan Walsh, maybe he'll end up, playing a part in the Celtics' future down the road. I just can't see him having an impact this upcoming season. So that was a little frustrating, but yeah, man, it got so confusing with the trades in the mid-20s. And then we hit a point in like the early second round where it looks like literally the first 10 picks of the second round were all traded. Like none of them went to the teams that they were originally slotted to go to before the draft started. So it was absolute chaos. Dudes are wearing the wrong hat left and right. You're going on Twitter, you're reading what Shams is saying because Woj basically retired from Twitter during the draft because he was on the ESPN broadcast. Super confusing, made for not a great product, and at that point only the hardos are watching the draft anyway, but I didn't love the experience of watching the draft. At least on the positive side of things, they stayed away from the sad, heartbreaking, like who died in your family storylines that we saw a lot of, with especially the NFL draft during the COVID year. That was particularly awful. But anyways, so those are some of the things that jumped out at me, and the final piece overall is Portland, right? Portland really jumped out at me, not calling them a winner, not calling them a loser, but I am saying that they have a major decision to make, right? because a lot of the debate, a lot of people said that the draft started at 4. Other people said that the draft started at 2 after Wembanyama, because basically at the second pick, you had Charlotte there, and there were 2 guys slotted to go either 2 or go 3 and in some order. And it was Brandon Miller, the forward out of Alabama, and then Scoot Henderson, the guard from the G League Ignite. Those 2 had basically their odds swapped on and off over the past couple days. A lot of people and prominent in the media seem to be Scoot guys just because of the charisma that he has. He does seem like a special player. I'd probably want to go with a guy like Scoot, to kind of be the face of the franchise for some of those teams at the top of the draft. But ultimately, Brandon Miller ended up being the pick to Charlotte. They felt like his, positional versatility, him being 6'9", fitting alongside LaMelo Ball would be a better positional fit and better address the team needs. And maybe they thought of him as a better overall prospect than Scoot. There's certainly an argument to be made there. But the important thing is that, look, Scoot Henderson fell to number 3 in the draft. It was the obvious pick for Portland. They made the right pick. They picked Scoot. And now where does that leave him, right? Now that Portland is clearly at a fork in the road moment, now Portland's 4 best assets are guards, and 3 of the 4 guards being, pretty significantly undersized. Those 4 guards being, of course, Dame, Scoot Henderson, who they just drafted, Shaedon Sharpe, who they drafted last year, and Anthony Simons, who they drafted a couple years ago, are arguably the 4 most talented players in the roster, and certainly the 4 best trade assets, in my opinion. So what do they do here, right? You could make the argument if they had, if Brandon Miller had been the one that fell to them, they wouldn't be forced as much into making a decision on Dame, because there is more of a logical fit for Dame to have, for Brandon Miller to fit alongside a guy like Dame, where, Scoot and Dame, the fit of those 2 on the court together, I'm not saying it can't work, but again, it just doesn't make much sense with the guards that you have on the roster. Now, again, when you're drafting that high in the draft, you're drafting that high in the draft because you have team needs all over the place. You should not draft based on team need. You should draft based on who is the best available player. They made the right pick and Scoot, but they do have more decisions to make. And frankly, I love Dame. I know he's allergic to the grind. He never wants to leave Portland. I understand that. I'm not saying you just have to ship that guy out, but I do think it's genuinely in the best interest of the franchise to move on from him. Give the keys to Scoot, keep Shaedon Sharpe around as well, and look to move on from a guy like Dame. Maybe even look on to move on from a guy like Anthony Simons and really rebuild this thing, because it's as good of an opportunity as any to rebuild. Because even if they make the move and they move on from Scoot and they move on from Shaedon Sharpe and they try to bring some veteran presence, I can't see a world in which they bring in enough talent around Dame to contend for a title with the roster. They have so much defensive, shortcomings already. They were basically the worst defense in the league last year, or certainly one of the worst defenses in the league last year. And them having all these small guards, as much as I like Scoot, he's not going to immediately make a positive impact on that defense, I don't think. So they're kind of going nowhere fast. They were also a team I put in purgatory, and I think that they should follow the Wizards lead anyway. Blow this thing up, build around Scoot, and see where they're at in years to come. So that's kind of my overarching thoughts on the NBA draft. I did want to go through and give my opinion on the 3 biggest winners of the draft, right? Who do I think were the biggest winners of last night, just based on their draft selections and some of the moves that they made? The first team, let's start off, let's get the obvious out of the way. The winner of the draft is San Antonio. It's boring, it's been overplayed. We talked about how good Victor Wembanyama is, but I have to mention him at the top. He's genuinely the best prospect that we've ever seen, probably since LeBron. He probably isn't as good of a prospect as LeBron, but he's 7'5". Even if he struggles shooting the ball, he doesn't shoot the ball as well as he did for his team in France this year. What he's going to provide on the defensive end immediately is going to be special. The dude's 7'5". He's got over an 8-foot wingspan. It's absolutely ridiculous what that guy is going to provide for San Antonio. He's genuinely bringing hope to the team that, as I said before, needed Wembanyama more than anybody else. So I think that they obviously won the draft, a couple weeks ago when they landed first in the lottery. And then I also like that they took Leonard Miller, a forward, also out of the G League Ignite, I want to say. They actually took him at number 33, so the start of the second round, and he was a dude that I saw on mocks that could have gone as high as into the 20s. So, and he's a really great athlete as well. So I think Leonard Miller is a guy that would pair nicely to the young core that they have in San Antonio. So San Antonio is the winner of the draft. Let's move on to some other teams that I thought really crushed it last night. And I think we got to talk about the Rockets, right? Obviously, they had the 4th pick in the draft. That was a little bit lower of a draft pick than they were hoping for. They obviously had a very good chance at Victor Wembanyama, and they weren't blessed like San Antonio was. They end up at number 4. They take the first of the 2 Thompson twins that were selected. They take Amon Thompson, whatever, of the overtime elite. He's somebody that's supposed to bring immediately a lot of playmaking to the team, really good size at basically 6'7", pretty solid defender as well. But frankly, a guard that can come in, play alongside Jalen Green, actually share the rock a little bit. So I think he's going to be a really solid pickup for them at 4. But that wasn't the pick that won them the draft, right? I think, the obvious pick and possibly the biggest story of the draft last night was Cam Whitmore, right? Cam Whitmore, a forward out of Villanova. He was a guy that some people had going as high as like 4 on some mock drafts. He ended up falling all the way to number 20, where he was selected by the Rockets. So, obviously the cameras are drawn to Whitmore, right? And they're showing him just like they showed, Will Levis at the NFL draft a couple weeks ago, right? They were kind of glued to him because he was the big faller of the draft. But, Houston had that second pick there, and it seemed like a pretty obvious choice. Like somebody was going to have to pull the trigger on him. Now, he probably fell, if you had to guess, I'd imagine it would have to be medical reasons at this point. I heard on a couple podcasts that there were some yellow flags surrounding his medical history. So that never really bodes well, and that's probably what kind of started his fall all the way into the 20s. But he's a dude that can score the rock right away, fitting in with the previous Rockets mold. Apparently he doesn't share the rock very much, but the way he can attack the basket, he's supposed to be a really special athlete at 6'7", with some outside shooting ability as well. Another toy for Ime, right? Ime is going to be, of course, the head coach of the Rockets next season, Ime Udoka, and so I think he's going to have a lot of talent to work with, and it wouldn't surprise me if Houston's able to turn that around pretty quickly by bringing in Thompson, bringing in Whitmore, already having some talent in Green, Şengün, Jabari Smith there. It'll be interesting to see how quickly Houston can turn this thing around. Finally, the biggest winner, kind of pains me to say this. I'm a bit of a Mavericks hater, but I do have to admit I was overall really impressed with the moves that Dallas made last night. And let's talk about it, right? Starting at the top, they had the 10th pick in the draft, right? This is what we talked about. They threw away the last couple weeks of the regular season, basically to make sure that they would, maximize their chances at landing that 10th pick. Of course, that paid off a couple weeks ago during the lottery, where it found out they got that 10th pick. If it was any later than 10, that pick would have actually gone to New York as the final piece of compensation in the original Kristaps Porzingis trade. And the first move that Dallas made was trading back from 10 to 12. So they traded with the Thunder. They moved 2 picks back, and the incentive for Dallas to do that trade and move back is they pawned off the shitty Davis Bertans contract to Oklahoma City, and in exchange for taking that dog shit contract, they moved back 2 picks in the draft. So move back 2 spots, they get rid of Bertans, and they draft Derek Lively, the center from Duke. This is a guy that was formerly a top high school recruit in his class. Massive frame, he's 7'1", 7'7" wingspan. Didn't watch a ton of college ball last year, but I did catch a couple Duke games. Apparently he's supposed to have outside shooting ability as well that he never really flashed at Duke. But what you do know that what you're getting in Lively is a really athletic guy, that someone that can rim run, someone that can protect the rim, and basically a 19, 20-year-old version of everything Dwight Powell does, but better, right? Even if that jump shot never develops for Derek Lively the way that people hope, it will be probably a bad pick at 12 if he doesn't end up, maximizing that, because you can get a lot of good athletes in the draft. You don't have to draft a center at number 12 if he doesn't end up developing that jump shot, but he should be immediately better than Dwight Powell right away, right? He would have to be horribly wrong for him to not be able to step into that shitty front court situation and immediately get minutes, right? So anyways, that they weren't done after moving back to 12 and making the Lively pick, right? They used the traded player exception that they acquired in that first deal, right? So they moved on from Bertans and they got like a traded player exception, and they basically used that to acquire Richaun Holmes from the Kings, as well as the number 24 pick. So Richaun Holmes was signed to a pretty bad contract a year or two ago. He's a big man for Sacramento that really couldn't even get minutes on Sacramento, who didn't really have a backup center, right? They played Trey Lyles in that spot a few different times, and Metu as well. Mainly Lyles was the one that shined during their limited playoff exposure, right, in the first round in the West. But that being said, they acquire Richaun Holmes, who isn't a good contract by any means, and it freed up a ton of cap space. That was the incentive for the Kings. The Kings got a bunch of cap space, and the Mavericks acquired pick number 24, so a late first round pick, and they acquired Richaun Holmes, right? So again, whatever you think of Richaun Holmes, I think he's more useful to the Mavericks than Davis Bertans was. Maybe he ends up cracking that front court rotation and ends up being insurance if Lively isn't ready right away. Because again, Dwight Powell should be no more than a 12th man on any NBA team, regardless of how good of a teammate he is. I'm sorry, the dude can't play. And that being said, they also got the 24th pick, in which they drafted Olivier Maxence Prosper, the forward out of Marquette. Everything I know about this guy is a freak athlete, and he defends the hell out of the basketball, right? That's his specialty. Offensively, he seems to be pretty limited. But look, Dallas, they address their biggest needs. They have no front court depth to speak of whatsoever. They address that with the first pick, getting Derek Lively at 12. And then they address their desperate need of a lockdown perimeter defender. And they got that in what they call Olivier Maxence Prosper. They call him Omax, I guess. People seem to be really high on him. And at the very least, there's no doubt about his ability to step into a team and immediately be able to defend. So I would go out on a limb and assume that he immediately assumes a role as a team's defensive specialist and probably best perimeter defender from day one. Will his offense be enough to keep him on the court where he's, if he can avoid being an offensive liability, I think he can play real minutes for them right away, which is saying something because, again, this is late first round. It's not often these guys step in for a solid team like Dallas and immediately make contributions. But Dallas knows that, look, they don't have many good players. That's not a secret. They needed to acquire more assets throughout the draft. And I think that they turned, one draft pick and a really shitty player in Davis Bertans into, three players that can immediately make a positive impact in Lively, Omax, and then Richaun Holmes as well. So I do like what Dallas ended up doing. So where there are winners in the draft, there are losers as well, right? So originally my plan, I was going to be like 3 winners and 3 biggest losers of the NBA draft. And I was going to run through that because it sounded nice and it could be part of the title and whatever. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, look, I can't lie. I don't know a ton about these guys. And I feel a lot better diagnosing 3 teams that I think are winners based on the team need and some of the moves that they made and how they were able to allocate some of their assets and, just addressing the needs on the roster for semi-competitive teams. So I felt good about naming those winners. But when it came to the losers, I was, I found one team that I'm going to talk about here in a second. And frankly, no other teams jumped out to me. So I just wanted to talk about, in my opinion, the biggest loser of the draft. And, this is probably low-hanging fruit. I've seen this covered a couple different places. But it didn't really feel like a good time for a zag for me, given my limited draft knowledge. But in my opinion, the biggest draft loser that I saw was the Orlando Magic. So, unfortunately, this one kind of pained me to say because the Magic were one of my favorite league pass teams, obviously non-Celtics teams last season. And they had, a lot of draft capital entering this draft. They had the number 6 pick. They had the number 11 pick as well. And I just don't really love the selections that they made. And so let's talk about it. They first picked Anthony Black, the tall point forward, if you will, 6'7". He's out of Arkansas. They took him at pick number 6. Of course, fitting with an Orlando tradition, he has great size given his position. He does a lot of things well on the court, but frankly, his lack of a jump shot or consistency at as far as a jump shot goes, really kind of hurts my opinion of this pick, right? They already have a bunch of guards that are question marks shooting the ball that have a lot of, flashes in Markelle Fultz and Jalen Suggs was a high pick who's shown some flashes over the past couple seasons, but I just don't love the Anthony Black selection. It feels like kind of a lateral move, compared to what they already have in Markelle Fultz. Best case scenario, he's a taller, Markelle Fultz, and maybe he develops a jump shot. I just didn't love the fit at 6. I thought there were better options on the board. And then at number 11, this was the one that was really tough. Again, I jokingly thought this guy could go to the Celtics at 25 because that's where most of the mocks had him. They drafted Jet Howard, the forward out of Michigan, again, son of Juwan Howard, at number 11. So while Cam Whitmore was easily the biggest, faller in the draft, he was on an absolute free fall from, mocked around pick 5 all the way down to 20. Jet Howard was definitely the biggest riser as someone mocked in the 20s who went all the way up to 11. And this pick had everybody puzzled. People said he wasn't even the most talented player on his team at Michigan. I know Kobe Bluffkin ended up going a couple picks later. I think he ended up in Atlanta, right? Let me double check that. Yeah, he ended up in Atlanta. So anyways, it's pretty interesting to see Jet go before his teammate at Michigan. And, again, like Orlando does, they draft a guy with great size, 6'8". If all goes well, right, you could have a potential lineup of Anthony Black at 6'7", Jet Howard at 6'8" at the 2, and then you could have Franz and Paulo at 6'10", 6'11" at the forward spots, and then have Wendell Carter at 6'11" at the center position. Or if you want to get crazy, you can toss 7'2" Bol Bol out there Orlando's got height all over the place. I just feel like I would have liked to see them get somebody a little bit more defined, maybe a little bit more proven at the guard position. Certainly someone more proven with the jump shot. I know, maybe they got screwed over when neither of the Thompson twins kind of fell to them at 6, but I just didn't like what Orlando did. If they really fell in love with a guy like Jet Howard, all signs are pointing to him being available later in the draft. So, a lot of teams had, I think there was only I think there was like 5 or 6 teams that had like 15 picks in the first round, right? That kind of usually means that there's a lot of different room for you to trade back in the draft. We saw a bunch of different teams execute trade backs to get guys to recoup more draft capital while still getting guys that were high on their board. If you are in love with a guy like Jet Howard and you want to pick him at number 11, odds are you might be able to trade back a couple picks and recoup some assets and maybe take him at like 15 or 18 or something like that, right? But Orlando, they stuck to their guns. They drafted the guy. So, in my opinion, they're the biggest loser right now. That being said, take it with a grain of salt. If these guys come out and are awesome right away, which they easily could be, I will be eating my words. And mock drafts are mock drafts for a reason, right? Nobody has any idea what is going to happen in the first round, unless you're Connor O'Shea, because Connor dominated our draft pool. He literally picked like half of the first round correct. It was kind of wild, so congratulations to him. If you're not Connor, you don't know anything about who's actually going to go where, because these mock drafts are always, there's always at least a few guys that are wildly inaccurate. So if they were really in love with this guy and they didn't want to mess around with the trade back, that's okay. They just, really have to hope that this pick works out, because if Jet Howard isn't a strong contributor for them right away, people are going to be pointing the finger at Orlando, because they are a team that a lot of people like with a lot of young talent. And if they aren't able to successfully build around Paolo and Franz, it's going to get ugly for them in short order, because they have a lot of young guys that need to get minutes on that team. All right, guys, that just about does it. Appreciate you guys sticking with me for a longer pod, especially for a solo episode. But we did have 3 really exciting trades to talk about, as well as the NFL draft, the NBA draft, which took place last night. So that was a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys enjoyed listening to this podcast. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching the draft last night. As far as the schedule for this podcast, I will be coming at you at some point next week. We should have a lot to talk about, right? We are, free agency for the NBA officially starts on July 1st. So, almost exactly a week from when you guys are going to be listening to this, we will have a bunch of initial signings going down. And even if I, get an episode out before that, we should be in like the somewhat semi-legal tampering phase where we know exactly who's going where, and we should have a couple different trades and signings to report. So that'll be basically what we talk about on the next podcast at some point next week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday of next week. I'll be back at you with another pod. And before I let you guys go, of course, follow @WordsWithWallace on everything: Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Apple Music, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Be sure to download the pod, rate and review the show if you're feeling generous today. Certainly share the show, tell a friend, and I will be back with you guys next week. I will talk to you then. Peace.